Thank you so much for joining me for enhancing communication and collaboration through custom search experiences. My name is Emily Mancini. This event would not be possible without our sponsors, Proximo 3, Low Code Era, Riata Consulting, and Cubix. To introduce you a little bit about myself, I'm a Microsoft MVP focused in Microsoft 365 and SharePoint. I'm also master certified in user experience by the Nielsen Norman Group, so you'll hear me referencing a lot of their studies throughout our presentation today. I'm also part of the PnP team and one of the repository owners for the Microsoft community content. This is an open source article repository where we share specific use cases and anyone can contribute to them of cross-product solutions in Microsoft 365. I'm currently a principal architect at Left Uncharted Consulting and the executive director of a nonprofit, Left Uncharted Inc., which provides free tech education. One of our events is M365 Miami, which is a free in-person conference. And before I entered consulting, I was a solo platform owner at a biotech. So I'll be sharing a lot throughout the presentation today, my experiences across being a platform owner as well as a consultant across different clients. You can see all my contact information there. And if you have any questions, comments, feel free to also ask them publicly on Twitter and use the hashtag Scottish Summit 2024 to keep the conversation open for anyone who also might want to join in. So before we dive into the more technical side of what we're going to be talking about today, let's just set the scope so that we're aligned on an example that we're using. Everything we're going to be talking about today can be used in Microsoft 365 in collaboration or communication scenarios. Today, we're going to focus on the scope of an intranet, so more based in the concept of sharing information with large audiences and making sure we're giving them the right information at the right time. One of my favorite resources is the periodic table of Microsoft 365. You can see here, this is from Matt Wade. We have a link at the bottom. We are highlighting the different areas that we will touch on today. We'll primarily be focusing in scenarios in SharePoint Online, but of course, this is also applicable to lists. And we'll have a quick call out about Viva Learning towards the end as well. So in SharePoint, we're going to be talking about lists, libraries, and apps. Now, as we go through our examples, any of these information architecture better practices or examples for search scenarios can apply to both lists and libraries. So even if I'm referencing this example applying only to a list or library, just remember that it works for both. So this is a very flexible solution, and we're covering a whole buffet of options for how you can create these different custom search experiences. We're going to be going over search bookmarks, search verticals, restricted search, highlighted content, web part, as well as PnP modern search web parts. Now, the first four of these solutions that we're going through are available by default in Microsoft 365. So they're already there in your tenant right now for you to use. As we continue down our different custom search examples and we want to increase our complexity of these experiences, we're going to bring in the community solution of PnP modern search web parts as well. Now, before we dive into building out these different custom search experiences, let's talk a little bit more about why usability is important, because really what we're talking about today is getting the right information to the right people at the right time. We're trying to reduce friction of people finding their content and improve their experience so they can get their jobs done more quickly. Here's an example of a user interface that I ran into this summer. I am based in the US, and admittedly, we don't have train systems as extensively as there are in Europe. And I was in France. I don't speak French. I was very intimidated at the busy train station to buy my ticket for the first time. And you can see here, I have a zoom in on the first screen where it's asking me to press the green button. And I'm standing here looking at this ticket booth, and the only green button I see is on the credit card, and that one's continually not working. Ultimately, what they were asking about is that large silver button to the left of that credit card panel. And they were referencing green, which first of all, isn't very accessible because not everybody can spot different interfaces through colors. As my stress increases, it's harder and harder for me to make decisions. And ultimately, I may not move forward with this. I might have to go ask for help. And when people are doing that in the office, that's what causes a lot of overload in your inboxes, drive-by questions. We want to make sure that we're not creating friction between someone trying to complete a task and understanding how to do it. To bring this more into our world of Microsoft 365, Microsoft did a survey of 18,100 people, and they were surveying how they work with information. And you can see it's pretty evenly split across how much time people are spending communicating, searching, creating, and consuming. Searching is slightly higher than everything else. It's 27%. Regardless, that's a lot of your day that you're just spent looking for the right information. If we could reduce how much time people are searching for that content, they can be communicating, creating. And that's really what we should be doing in our jobs, because that's the value that we're providing back. On top of that, when people are asked, how relevant is this information that you're spending all of this time with? About 50% of it is relevant for your job. So that means you're wading through tons and tons of information pollution to just try and find that content that you need. This is what I imagine really feeds into that 27% search time. So what we're talking about today is reducing those scopes so that people aren't wading through so much extra content looking for the exact thing that they need. And we're giving them more declarative options of the right content. Very often people talk about good usability and they say, I have a really small project budget. I don't know that I can spend time or money on this. So here's our justification of how much time you can spend on usability and how big it will actually impact the outcome and usability of your project. So Nielsen Norman Group, who I mentioned earlier, the world leaders in user research, they did a study. And they measured people doing the 18 most common tasks across their intranet. They found that for intranets that had very low usability, it took about 49 minutes for them to complete those tasks. For ones that had good usability, it took 25 minutes. Now, this doesn't sound like so big of a difference, but it is pretty large because what we're talking about ultimately is a 49% decrease in time spent. Now, this may not be much if you're looking at it as a one-off scenario, but if these are 18 common tasks in our intranet, we're probably doing them many times throughout the year. So if we take that task time, how many times they're likely to perform it during that year, we'll find out how many estimated hours per year we're actually wasting just looking for this content. And we can see it's an entire work week that we're spending looking for content in an intranet when we have low usability. And it's half of a work week when we're talking about good usability. Ultimately, this justification is saying if we spend 10% of a project's budget on usability activities, it actually doubles usability. So you can see here, if someone was building out an intranet, you can cut the time in half that all of your colleagues are finding this common information by just spending 10% of that budget. So it makes a really big impact focusing on usability throughout your communication and collaboration experiences. Now, we can't just calculate our return on investment in the project cost, of course. We're also measuring it in that usability. So people are using the solutions more often, they're more efficient. So we're seeing that 27% of time searching decreasing. And there's ultimately that higher user satisfaction. If your colleagues can use the systems to find what they need efficiently, they're not going to spend time asking other people to answer their questions. They're just going to be able to move forward with their tasks. When people are reading on the web, it's a little bit different than when we are reading on paper. And we're doing what's called satisficing. So we're scanning until we find an answer that's adequate for the information we need. We don't do it because we're lazy. We do it because it's more efficient. And again, we're wading through that information pollution, which leads us to do even more and more satisficing. The risk of this is, are we making the wrong decisions in this satisficing because we missed some critical content in that scan? Ultimately, people are reading about 28% of what's on the page. So if we're giving them that information overload, it's really likely they're going to miss that critical content. And when people are looking for content, they're doing it two different ways. One is the findability of the content. So we know that this information exists, and we just want to be able to locate it. Discoverability is we don't really have prior knowledge of this different content or features, so we need to be able to discover them and find them on our own. And there's quite a few different scenarios that we'll be hitting throughout our examples. People may know where it exists. It may be exactly where they expect it. They're probably using navigation. They may know it exists, but not where expected. So now they're using search. Maybe they know something like it exists, so they're trying to find something related. They found it previously, can't find it again. They don't know if it exists at all. That's when we're really focusing on that discoverability. And then, of course, I know it exists, but it's inaccessible. We don't have a solution for that today because we were talking about search, and we know that search honors permission boundaries. So if someone doesn't have permission to the content, they will not be able to find it. It's as if it doesn't exist. So for today, we're going to go through our different default search scopes, so we have a good understanding of our current state, what we're trying to solve for. And then we're going to go through those 4 different search experiences and talk about why you might want to use each of them and how to implement them. So to go very quickly over our modern world, so our modern site architecture is a flat world. We have different site collections, team sites and communication sites that are then creating parent-child relationships and connections through hub sites. We know that these hub sites allow us to change the associations very quickly without breaking links, which provides that better user experience than when we used to have the formal sub-sites and parent-child relationships previously. So they're very, very flexible. And they give us quite a few different things. What we're focusing on right now when we're talking about hub sites is only going to be the search scope. So we're talking about the concept that the hub site and associated sites is creating different default scopes as well. So let's dive into our example intranet structure and see how this impacts finding content. So here you can see we have an intranet where we have a home site, we have an associated hub site in human resources, and then of course we have associated sites below that. It's very common in our scenario of an intranet. You have communication sites that are part of that intranet, but then you have all your collaboration spaces that live outside of that. We're going to use a couple of different user needs statements about finding content in our intranet, and we're going to be using that structure to show you the impact of those different search scopes as we go throughout. If you're unfamiliar with user need statements, this is an actionable problem statement. So we're talking about who is trying to accomplish a task and ultimately what that end goal is. For example, we have individual contributors at our organization. They want to find the company policy for social media so that they can comply. They want to post correctly. So today we're going to be going through 3 different scenarios of our user need statements. And one of the most important things to think about when you're creating user need statements is this idea that there's varying roles in your organization and they all have different needs. So if you look down our left column, you can see we have individual contributors. These are people who may have been there longer. We have a new hire who's going to have to learn information for the first time. That's going to be a lot different than someone who's been at the company for 10 years. And then of course we have role-specific different needs. So a manager may need to have different tasks that they complete and access to different information that an individual contributor may not. So let's start out with our example of a new hire just started at the company. They need to get a company card so they can apply for purchases and they can make purchases in an approved method. So let's go back to our intranet structure and what happens when I search for company card. If I search for company card from my intranet home site, which I also recommend very often, it makes sense for that to be your root site. So then when it's your root site, it searches your entire tenant. So if someone starts to look for how do I apply for this company card on the intranet, and they're starting on that home site where all the different hub sites and other communication sites are associated, they're going to be searching across all of that entire structure. You saw it also included the team sites because in this scenario, our home site's also our root site. So when I'm starting from the beginning at the top of that structure, I find all the content that I need. Well, I'm a new hire and I've been talking with HR and HR has been doing all of my onboarding. So what happens if I go a level down and I search for a company card within human resources? It'll search the hub site, as you can see outlined in green, as well as all the different sites associated to it. Well, now I'm not getting a result. Although you can see I do have breadcrumbs at the top that helps me move up in my search scopes. So I can select travel, which is that intranet home site. And all of a sudden I'm searching all of that structure again, and I can find the content. Now, while I'm going to be offering a lot of scenarios and solutions to reduce the need to know this, it is really important to train the organization on the default search scopes and how to navigate through them so they have a good understanding. As you are in a site and go into a list or library, again, that top search bar does change in scope of where it's looking. So that's a good basis to have your organization understand. But then, of course, you can build all these different solutions so that people don't need to find content that way, and you're really handing it to them in an easier way. Now, one of the first questions that I get, especially with the opening of Copilot, is how do I limit default search scopes? Now, while you can do this, I don't necessarily recommend it. You can use restricted SharePoint search. It disables your organization-wide search, and you're curating which SharePoint sites are going to be part of it. The reason I don't recommend this is it's going to create technical debt in the future. It's really just a Band-Aid on a bigger problem, and it makes a lot more sense to work on creating a great information architecture, which we're going to go over today. When you turn on this restricted SharePoint search, it will show you when you're interacting with Copilot, it'll tell you that it's searching within this restricted scope. So there is a small signifier for people to know it's not searching everything. Messing with the default search scopes, I think, can create a lot of different problems. Instead, let's talk about making custom experiences to get the right content available to our end users at the right time. So let's dive into some of these different search experiences, starting with the lowest complexity. One of the first solutions that you can use is what's called a search bookmark. You can see it at the top of my screen in the card. It says apply for a company card. I can have any URL internal to Microsoft 365 or external. I can add a little description, and I can pick different keywords for that search bookmark. You can make these in the Search and Intelligence Center. You can do them manually, or you can also have the system recommend some to you. When you're creating them, as I mentioned, you have your title, URL, description, keywords. You can also have different categories, different audiences, dates that they're published. So you have a lot of flexibility in controlling how and when this information is surfaced. My one big warning for you all is when you repeat keywords, the Microsoft Graph will choose a search bookmark that matches primarily, and they don't show all the information of that second search bookmark. So we're going to take a peek here on, we used the keyword Mexico City on 2 search bookmarks. We used it on a search bookmark also titled Mexico City, and we also used it on a search bookmark titled for Best City to Visit. Because our keyword matches our title in the first search bookmark, that's what's going to be promoted in our results. And you'll see here in this video, when we search for Mexico City, we'll get that first Mexico City card. Now, our second search bookmark, Best City to Visit, very tiny related link. I'm losing the description. I'm losing a lot of that information sent, providing more context of why I might want to go to that link. So I strongly recommend trying not to repeat keywords when possible. I mentioned there's other settings you can put on these search bookmarks, dates that it's published. Let's say you have a certain period that someone needs to complete something. Maybe it's annual reviews. That search bookmark only appears during that time. You can have it show for everybody in the organization or only specific people. Despite all of this, they're only available from the root site. So if your intranet home site isn't your root site, you won't be able to find them. And if someone goes into that human resources and tries to find that company card, they're not going to get that declarative answer that we created with a search bookmark. So we still have that search scoping issue that we just talked about based in our default search scopes. So how can we change these? How can we show information a little differently? One of our next solutions is search verticals. You actually already have these in your search. Files, sites, people, news, video, images. So these are the different tabs on top of the page that will reduce your results based on what those queries are. We have a little more flexibility here. We can create search verticals on the organization level, but here we have an improvement. We can also do them on the site level. So for example, if we're in that human resources site with onboarding, we could have a search vertical for onboarding tasks, and it will only pull in information that matches that search query where we tagged things as an onboarding task. Not necessarily solving our problem of those search scopes though, and me being in the wrong location trying to find content. So let's dive in to surfacing content across these peer site collections. Again, our modern world is flat. So we know that if I'm searching in human resources and one of my peer sites has the information, unless I go up those breadcrumbs for the default search scopes, I'm not going to find it. So let's talk about creating policies and a policy center. Essentially, what we're talking about, going back to that intranet structure, is this idea: if I'm searching in human resources, I'm not going to pull content from finance. If I'm searching in finance, I'm not going to pull information from human resources. I'm going to show you the end result first of what we can do with different web parts, and then we're going to go backwards and talk about how to create this robust information architecture to support these experiences. Our first option is the highlighted content web part. This is one of our out-of-the-box web parts. If you've worked with SharePoint Classic, this is our successor to Content Query and Content Search web parts. And this is where we're hitting what we want. We can display content from multiple sources in one place on a page. So let's say we want all policies from every department to show up on one page. This is one of our solutions. And we can create those custom queries with KQL, CAML, as well as using some of those managed properties. I'm going to go into this much deeper after you see the end results. But essentially, to start, what we did was we're making a content type in the content type gallery. So it's available across the whole organization. And we can either use our GUID for the content type ID or the content type name itself to create a very simple search query. So here you can see we have an out-of-the-box SharePoint page. We have our policy center. We added in one of those the highlighted content web part that comes with our tenant for free. We selected to have a custom query, and you can see our query text we're setting to the SharePoint content type equals policy. So that means any document that we tagged to that content type from any site across our tenant, because we're saying all sites in the hub as our source, will now pull into this one page. So I can direct my end users to one spot to find all information, regardless of who does what in the organization. We shouldn't have to know who owns the document, who owns the policy or business process to find it when we're going across the internet. That reduces our discoverability, adds a lot of friction. When we're configuring our highlighted content web parts, we have a couple different options for sort. Unfortunately, we can't sort by title. So depending on how you're surfacing your content, what the context of that is, that can be very limiting. We have a few different options for our layout as well that come automatically. Now, let's talk about our limitations, because you know I'm heading you towards the PnP Modern Search web part. Some challenges we have in the highlighted content web part is we have no filters. So if we're presenting large amounts of information, people have to manually go through that. That's that information pollution we were talking about earlier. That's not necessarily helping people find their content faster. It's also a web part just surfacing what we told it to on a page. You can't search within those results that are presented on the page. So again, if it's a large amount of content, really hard for me to narrow it down and find that specific thing I'm looking for. Depending what your content is, you might want to present different information about it. And we don't have the ability here to make custom views. So we may not be able to show all of the different pieces of our information architecture or metadata that we want to, that help people understand that this is the item that they're looking for. In user experience, we talk a lot about the Hick-Hyman law. So this is this idea that the more content, the more options there are, whether it be navigation, search results, it's going to take us exponentially more time to make a decision. So the whole context of our talk today is, how do we reduce that friction? How do we reduce that information pollution so people can make faster decisions, be more efficient, reduce that 27% search time? So let's talk about PnP Modern Search web parts, because they are a great option when you have higher volumes of content and more complexity around what you want to show. Now, this is one of those community solutions. So it is an open source web part, which also means you're going to have to install it into your tenant. It comes with multiple web parts. So not only do you have the search results, you also have a search box, search filters, as well as search verticals. So you can add that all in a page in context of where people might be looking for that content. And then, of course, I mentioned that highlighted content web part does not have customization in your views. You can do a lot in PnP Modern Search Web Parts when it comes to customizing those views and making sure how you're presenting your content is actionable and makes sense contextually for the people viewing it. I got to be honest with y'all, it's also by far my favorite web part. It's so flexible in so many different scenarios. So let's go take a look at it live and see why this is such a strong solution. Going back to our example, our user needs statement of that policy center. In our decentralized content world, our modern world that is flat, one of our better practices are that each policy owner should be managing their policies where they're already working. We don't necessarily want to ask our content owners to go to multiple places to edit their content. It's challenging for them, and it's also going to create some potential permissions challenges depending on how you set it up. You don't necessarily want someone in HR to be able to edit the legal policies, for example. So how do we make it easier for the back end for those content creators? Let them have it where they're already working. But we already know we want to reduce that friction between identifying different things to do, maybe action items on a policy, or even just locating the document itself. So as an end user, I shouldn't have to need to know whose responsibility that policy is for me able to locate it. I should just be able to see everything at the company very easily so I can be compliant. As we dive into talking about our information architecture, not only are we talking about creating these custom search experiences for the consumers, we might also have some common tasks around managing the policies. And when we dive into talking about our information architecture through content types and site columns, that can actually help us as content owners, creating different views that we often use, having automated reminders, and maybe even some dashboard reporting for leadership. So we're talking about reducing time, not only for the content consumer to find it, but also the content creator managing the content, creating any status reports, building slides for leadership. So creating this information architecture helps everybody from the beginning to the end of the process around policies. What we're going to look at is a custom search page. So it's a SharePoint page, and we have embedded different web parts from PnP Modern Search Web Parts. We have the search box, the search filters, and the search results. The search box will search our metadata, which includes our content types and site columns, which we'll talk about next. It also searches the actual content of the document. So maybe you have a policy that doesn't have an intuitive name, but some of the words you're referencing are within the body of the document. That search box will also find those. You can see in our 1/3 left web part, we have the ability to add filters. When we add in these, we can have filters the different we're calling departments. So that's not metadata that I have to ask a policy owner to enter. We already inherently know that from where it's saved. Again, one of those positives of decentralized content management, doing some of the work for us already. We can also use any of our content types or site columns that we develop to be filters to refine that content. And then in our search results, we can show different types of information. We can show some of this different metadata. We can show it as cards. We can show it as line items. We can have previews. We can even have buttons there that make an actionable step for how someone is going to be interacting with the content. So let's look at one of these pages in my less than pretty dev tenant. So we're starting from that home site, which is our root site. We're searching for policy. We're seeing pages. We're seeing search bookmarks come up as results, but we want to go to the full results page. Now, the first thing we're getting is that travel policy center, which is the custom page we made. And as we're going down the page, you're also seeing that because we used the word policy, we're pulling up some of these other documents. Instead of using search and trying to wade through and find all the policies that exist, now instead we're going to that custom SharePoint page, which we just saw as a low fidelity wireframe. So here is that actual page in action. We have a short description at the top of the page, letting people know what to expect and how to use this page. We have our search box, our search verticals, filters, and results. So let's start to use this page and see what happens. If I change the effective date, if I change the search verticals, you can see my search results in this page are getting reduced. You can choose in your search filters whether it is and or for the selections that you're making. And then when we find the content that we want, you can click right on it and then read the policy. Of course, our social media policy is a joke. Don't post isn't our real guidance, just for the sake of example. So we have a lot of different capabilities that we can use in Modern PnP search web parts. You don't always have to use all of them on the same page. Sometimes people will just use the search results web part because you're surfacing a low amount of content and you just want, anytime you update the metadata, for your documents to appear in all of the right places. So it doesn't have to be as many of the web parts as you just saw for it to function well. Now let's take another look at how we can use that Modern PnP search web part for a different type of content. We're going to look at the manager perspective. They want to support their individual contributors, understanding business processes so they can empower their growth and advancement of their skills. If you have an organization that doesn't have a learning management system, this is a really great place to start to organize your content. Because essentially our challenge is we want to centralize content in various formats. It might be some external links, so URLs that live outside of our intranet, maybe some short tips or tricks, as well as longer documents that might be PowerPoint, Word, or full-length videos. Regardless of what the type of content is, we want them all to appear in the same spot, again, to reduce that friction of people trying to find their content. Highly recommend, if you're a small organization, begin that culture of documenting before it's needed. This is something that can become a huge project once there's too much institutional knowledge. So even if they're just short pieces of guidance, again, we're trying to reduce the overload of people asking questions in person when we can asynchronously provide them what they need. Training documentation also is important if your organization is quickly growing, or maybe you have rotating staff, for example. Maybe you have volunteers or people seasonally coming in to help. Having a central area for them to asynchronously all have a place of truth for what's expected is really helpful in supporting their ability to support the organization. This is a great way also to centralize information around what to use when, whether it's what to use when in Microsoft 365 or any of your external systems at your organization. You can make it very clear what we use, when we use it, why we use it. We're going to dive into these structures a little bit later of our content types and site columns, but essentially what we're talking about is this idea that we might have documents for training, and we also might have items in a list. So as I promised, anything that we're talking about applies to lists or libraries. You can also pull content from lists and libraries into these web parts and show them simultaneously, so people don't need to know the source of where they're coming from. So in this example, we're saying our training documents are those lengthy PowerPoint or Word documents, but then we have some training tips, which we don't need a whole document to support it. It's a quick question and an answer. And we want people to be able to find those documents as well as the tips all in one place. Very often people make frequently asked questions lists, but that introduces another place I have to then go look. If I don't find it in the training documentation, now I have to go to another area and see if it's there. Again, that's introducing friction. That's what's causing that 27% time of searching, because I'm having to go various areas to try and track this down versus my one-stop shop for everything that I need. We can use these PnP modern search web parts to surface our source of truth information. So we have one document, and we can show that one document across various sites, various pages. When we first launched this at Left Uncharted, our consulting company, we had a news post, and we wanted to introduce the idea of those short training tips. We call them tiller tips, since they're helping you navigate your boat on the right course. We like to be punny with Left Uncharted with maps and navigation. So we made a news article, and we can surface those tiller tips there. Now, when people go to our full training center, the same information from that one source of truth will also show there. So I change it in one place, and then it updates everywhere. So it's really powerful to make sure that you're not duplicating content, there's less to manage, and you have those declarative answers for people, therefore reducing that information pollution. So let's take a look. Again, this is actually our real Left Uncharted tenant, and we're going to take a look at our training center. So again, in our navigation, we're going to a SharePoint page where we put all of these different PnP modern search web parts. You can see this one looks a little bit different. It's a little more simple. We just have a search box to search for training. We have the ability to filter those two different types of training, whether it's a SharePoint page or whether it's those one-line items of those tiller tips that people can then pull up. Now, I'm not seeing what I need. I'm trying to understand what tone we should use. So when I search for tone, it searches content of our different pages and list items. Here you can see it brought up our SharePoint page, which is one of our results. And right there is our tone, clear, succinct, and optimistic. So I didn't need to know what format the content was in or who owned it for me to be able to find my answers. Here is our wireframe of what we just looked at live, where we have our filters based off of that different metadata, and then we have our results. So this library is really good support for maybe someone who's been at the organization longer and has a general idea of what they're looking for. You might want to consider how new employees need more linear guidance for new processes. This is when you might bring in different solutions like Viva Learning, where you can make those narrative paths or learning pathways. Now that you've seen the power of how we can centralize content across our different site collections through highlighted content web part or PnP modern search web parts, let's talk about how we actually set up our information architecture to make this possible. So our first step, let's create our robust information architecture together. Very often when we bring up information architecture, people think it is just the site structure. So it's our navigation, it's our site collections, it's how we link from one item to the other. But it's a whole lot more than that. What we're really talking about are our different users, the varying needs that they have, which again, using those user needs statements is really helpful for us to understand who needs what in the organization. Then, of course, we're talking about the content that we want to show to them. And we also want to make sure we're presenting it to them in the right context. So continuing on our example of onboarding in HR, we want to make sure that we're showing the correct onboarding information in the area of our intranet where we're talking about onboarding versus pointing people to many different places to go and then find their way back to HR where that other information was from the overview perspective. Instead, they're in one spot, getting what they need, right content in the right context based off of who they are as a user and what they're trying to find. When we talk about what information architecture is in SharePoint, this also applies to Microsoft Lists. I like to break it down into 3 different categories of site hierarchy, navigation, and retention. What we're really going to be focusing on next is talking about those lists and libraries, how we can use content types, site columns, and manage metadata to create the information architecture so we can have those custom search queries. For anyone who's unfamiliar what content types are, they can be a document, list item, or folder. So again, as I mentioned, everything we talk about applies to lists and libraries. And essentially what a content type does is it's a named item, and we can then pull together different information through site columns. The content type name itself is also a piece of metadata. So if I say at my organization we have policies, I know I can make a policy content type. You can also attach different templates to your document content types. So if there's a certain format of how a policy should always look, you can actually connect that directly to the content type. So when someone's in a library and they say new policy, they're automatically getting a document with that template to use. What we don't have time to go into today is how these can also be used for different information management settings. So when you want to explore things like retention, these are very powerful there as well. Now, before we go into your business-specific examples of what content types are, let's take a fast look at what kind of ones we have in music and streaming services, since it's something we are all using. So whether we are talking about iTunes, Spotify, any other way you're consuming your music, we're talking about different pieces. So an artist is our content type. So it's a named item, and things we know about an artist are their name and likely the languages they sing in. Now, artists can have multiple albums. So you can see here, if you inherit from one content type to another, you can actually bring over some of those different site columns from before. So in our album, we already know our artist name and language, but maybe we want to be adding unique information to an album, like the title, year, producer. Now within albums, we have multiple tracks. The track titles are different. All the track lengths are different. You might also have some featured artists on some songs, but not others. So you have the ability to have content types that are standalone or inherit from each other. So that way you're bringing over similar columns across them all. Now, why do content types matter? First thing that we're doing is we're defining a set of site columns or columns in general, though I do recommend building them at the site level, for an item. So we're saying at our organization, for policies, we want to know about effective date and expiration date. These columns provide more declarative information about the item. If we use the default document content type, that's not telling Microsoft Graph when we're searching that there's anything special about that item. But when we start using content types, it will actually rank the results higher in the search index over text in the document or the title itself. So if we have a document that we tag to the content type of policy, it will show up higher in our search results than if it's just in the title alone. So this can actually move it from a second page of results to at least the bottom of the first half page. And again, we can use these content types to apply those information management settings. If we don't have content types, you'd be applying it to everything in your environment, and you will not have happy end users. So when do we build them? I would argue anytime you can name an object. At a minimum, you're putting in a title, it's going to promote it in your search results. If there's any additional information you need to know about that item, you can add those through different columns. If this same object exists in multiple places, it adds consistency, and this is what we're using to bring different content across the site collections. So we are going to centralize that content with our different GUIDs of our content types. You might also have different processes for different types of business objects. Maybe a statement of work has an approval process that is different than a policy approval. So naming these items allow you to create those Power Automate flows and treat them differently. And then, of course, we want to apply those retention policies mindfully. Now, if you have a spreadsheet in Excel called Tracker and you have information about your different documents, that's your metadata right there. You don't need to go to an Excel document and then find that content in your libraries. You can actually take these columns of information that you declared are important, name your content type, put those site columns in there, and your tracker all of a sudden is your library views. In addition, because you're building that in your library, you can now have Power BI dashboards, reducing that manual reporting, and of course, for those custom search experiences that we just saw. Now, for anyone who's thinking, I don't use content types in my organization, you do. We have the default document content type and item in all lists and libraries. We're talking about this idea of making other content types and libraries that are named differently and treating that content separately. A great place to start that I recommend is content type publishing. So this is in our content type gallery, which you can also access through the SharePoint Admin Center. I like to go to it. It's actually a site collection itself. So I go to site/content type hub, and then I build out my site columns and content types. When we build these content types in the content type gallery, it makes it possible to have it across all different site collections in our environment. So what we're doing is we are putting them at the tenant level, and people can opt in to pulling them into their site collections as needed. If you worked with content type publishing before September 2021, you may remember it used to automatically push to all the sites, which caused different issues. It's a lot more improved where we just opt in now. So we can really just choose the select ones that apply to us. There's a lot of different options in Microsoft 365, and right now we're focusing on the idea of how we can have our metadata across site collections. We are just focusing at the top item of content type gallery because, as you can see, doesn't require any code. So really good entry level opportunity for people. As you get more complex, you can see at the bottom of our table, you may want to use things like site templates, PnP provisioning templates. That requires code and a lot more time than we have today to talk about. So we're not going to dive into that just yet, but feel free to reach out to me at any time to chat more about it. So going back to our content type gallery, as you can see, I mentioned it's a site collection at Sites Content Type Hub. You get in the left nav, you can get to it from the SharePoint Admin Center under Content Services. So let's start building out some for our organization. Common one I see is around benefits documents. We know that there's different types of benefits documents, maybe claim forms or benefit summaries, but we know any benefit document, we always want to know what benefit type it is, medical, dental, vision, and what year it applies to. Claim forms, we might need to know the deadline we need to submit it by or the vendors that we're working with. For our benefit summaries, we might need to see who's eligible. Now in policies, let's say as an organization, we all agreed we want a policy content type, we want an effective date and an expiration date. Well, each department has unique needs and we want them to be able to be the special snowflakes that they are. So we can use what's called content type inheritance to inherit from that tenant level policy content type in the content type gallery. I'll get any columns that are ever added in the content type gallery and published out, but I can add in what matters to me in legal. I'll call it a legal policy and I'll add in a site column for risk category. Human resources has different needs. Maybe there's different eligibility, whether you're full-time, contract, volunteer. When I create that search page, I can put in my GUID for policy, that parent content type with an asterisk at it, and it will automatically pull any content type that people have created inheriting from my parent content type. So as the policy center owner, I don't need to know about all the unique special snowflakes out there. That content's going to be automatically pulled into my search experience, also reducing my need to manage it. I have a couple quick tips for you when you are creating this information architecture, some better practices to make your life easier in the long run. My first one is to name your document libraries and site columns without spaces. So you can see on the first one, when we named it without a space, we don't get this dreaded %20 in our URL. You'll also get that dreaded %20 in your site columns if you first create it with a space. Just do camel case, save it, go back in and add the space as your second step. And then your internal names will be a lot easier to navigate when you are building out these different search queries or trying to pull the information into Power BI. You can use your actual list and library titles to start providing some of that metadata because that's a piece of information we can query on and show in our filters. So instead of putting everything in that default documents library, I'll create unique libraries with titles based off of what the content is going to be inside. Very often when we are building these different scenarios, especially with lists, we might have information that's repeated. To reduce that data entry so people are actually filling out the metadata, I recommend using lookup columns when possible. I run an event. We have contact information about potential sponsors. We have different sponsorship packages. And then we actually have the tracker itself where we're working with this information. I don't need to re-enter the potential sponsor contact information every single time that I am entering in an item in the sponsor tracker. And again, I don't need to be entering those sponsor levels every time. They're the same all year. So if I use a lookup column in my sponsor tracker to those other lists, I can bring over that additional information and reduce my workload. My one warning is if you are using SharePoint Premium to autofill these columns, it does not support lookup columns, unfortunately. Sometimes when you're building out your information architecture, you might need to have multiple content types in the same library. If you need to look at different types of information simultaneously, it makes sense to put them in the same library. If you don't, I recommend putting them in different libraries. If you do have multiple content types in one library, make sure you leave the default document content type as the default in that library as well, so people aren't accidentally applying metadata that may not apply. So if we took that one out, we'd have to choose policy or statement of work as our default. Neither of them might actually be that document. All of a sudden, we're mistagging information. So it's really helpful to have someone have to opt in to put in all of that metadata. When you're building your information architecture, your content types and site columns, highly recommend doing it at least at the site level because that allows you to reuse your information across lists and libraries. Better yet, if your organization can agree on that high level to make it available across site collections, we would use the content type gallery that we just took a look at. Now, again, can't do that when we're using autofill in SharePoint Premium. Unfortunately, they are only supporting list level and library level columns. So you'd have to look at those more complex template options like site templates to be able to bring that same information architecture across site collections. When you're naming your content types, remember that we're tagging one content type to one document or one item. So when we are creating our policy content type, My one document is a policy, and we have multiple policies in our library, and that's where we see that it's plural. Mark Anderson has a great tip. If you can't use your IA in a sentence and have it make sense, then you don't have them named correctly. You're not going to tag the social media policy to the policies content type in the policy library, right? That's reversed. Now, if you're thinking, we don't need that, I have a site column called document type. Each different type of document, I would argue, is most likely a content type, because a policy has different site column and metadata needs than a contract or a statement of work. So you can see here on the left, we divided out those different document types that were site columns into multiple libraries, content types, and metadata. You don't want people to be guessing what information applies when. Earlier in my examples, I also referenced this idea that you can inherit content types. So when the policy content type for the organization doesn't have my unique needs in legal and I want to add in different site columns, I can inherit from that one and add in my special needs. And whenever possible, if you have information that's consistent across your organization, you'll want to consider putting that managed metadata in the term store. So the departments are the same across the whole organization. Everyone needs year, everyone needs month, everyone probably needs office locations. And you can actually set different owners in the term store. So HR can be responsible for departments. You don't, as IT, have to be responsible for all of them. And once you have all of this set up in your library, highly recommend leaving that all documents or all items unfiltered and ungrouped with all of your different columns, so you have a source of truth when you are trying to discover why something not filtering the correct way. So now we've made our wonderful information architecture. You already saw what we did in step 2. We then take those different pieces like SP content type equals policy. You can get more complex and expand your filtering to reference different site columns as well, different sites, and then you surface them in those web parts in context on pages. Ultimately, what we talked about today, I know that was a lot of information across a couple of different scenarios, but we talked about the search bookmarks, highlighted content web part, PnP modern search web part. Here is your search feature comparison chart talking about the different capabilities to help you decide what to use when. None of them are necessarily wrong. They just have different strengths in different use cases. Thank you so much for joining me today talking about custom search experiences. And again, thank you to our sponsors, Proximo 3, Locodera, Riata Consultancy, and Cubix for making this possible.